I'm going to be talking about the role of government in the free market economy. So this is going to be about the activities of the government, taxes and spending, how much of the economy is actually controlled by the government through taxes and spending, and what are the typical justifications for government in a free market economy, or just for government in general. So we'll talk about things like rule of law and the importance of contract enforcement, poverty alleviation, social safety net, inequality, market failures, and a little bit of macroeconomics, fiscal policy and monetary policy. And hopefully I'm going to dispel some myths of conventional wisdom for you. But first I'm going to start out, I always start out my talks with a poll. So for this, you are going to need a phone or a laptop or a tablet. And I want you to go on that phone or laptop or tablet to this address here, pollev.com/Rauh. I'm going to put this over here because I think it's getting double feedback. pollev.com/Rauh, R-A-U-H. And when you're there, there's going to be this poll here. And I'm going to activate the poll so that you'll be able to answer it when you get there. Okay, so now it should be active now, pollev.com/Rauh. So you should be able to answer this, and I'll just read it aloud. Consider 5 countries in which the government controls a different percentage of the economy. Okay, so 10%, 25%, 33%, 50%, and 75%. So imagine those five economies. And the question is, what is the largest level of government control where you would still say that this country is a free market economy? Oh, sure. Yeah. So 5 countries in which the government controls 10%, 25%, 33%, 50%, and 75% of the economy. What is the largest level of government control where you would still say the government is a free market economy? Okay, so please try to answer the poll. I see people are succeeding at answering it here. I see 8, 9, 10 people have answered. Okay, I'm looking for about 20 to have answered. Don't think about it too hard. It's not a right or wrong answer. It's just, what would you consider a free market economy? If somebody told you the government controls 10% of the economy, is that a free market economy? They control 25%, is that free? What's the largest level where you would still say that it's a free market economy? Okay, so 18 people have answered, 19, so should be getting there. Okay, I'll just give you 3 more seconds. Just pick an answer if you haven't done it. 3, 2, 1. Okay, I always wanted to be a game show host in another lifetime. 48% of you picked the number in the middle, the 33%. Okay, so about half of you said that, at around 33%. That would be of these that I've offered you, about the largest level of government control where you would still say the country is a free market economy. And the rest were kind of balanced around that. So about 28% of you said 25% would be the maximum, and about 16% of you said that 50% would be the maximum. And there are a few who would say that the maximum you would accept would be 10%, and a few of you who said that the maximum you would accept would be 75%. But so the sort of modal response is kind of in the middle, 33%. Okay, one more. So according to the figures from the Financial Report of the United States government, now this is a bit more of a factual question. So you could Google this, but don't Google it. I know you're very, very good at finding information online. Don't ask ChatGPT. Just do it. Take your best guess. According to the figures from the Financial Report of the United States government, so official U.S. government figures, the unfunded obligations of the United States, debts plus unfunded retirement and medical care programs, amount to approximately what amount? Okay, so is it $2,387 per person, $23,873 per person, $238,738 per person, or over $2.3 million per U.S. person? Okay, total debts plus unfunded liabilities. So this would be if you were going to pay off all of the United States debts and obligations that are not yet funded, where there's no funding source yet, including all the pensions. Social Security is our national pension program. Medicare is our national medical care program for the elderly. We also have Medicaid, which is a program for the poor. How much? What would it amount to? I'm going to close it down now, and we're going to look at what it is. So turns out that 60% of you got it right. It's $238,738 per U.S. person. So it's this one. And this comes from $79.5 trillion of unfunded debts or obligations, and a number of people in the United States, about 333 million. Okay, so that's how far in debt we are. And so the reason that I kind of go through this is, especially as we think about the relationship between the first question and the second question. This first question was about how much government spending there is in any given year. And the second question is about how much debt the country has run up. And if you think about it, what is spending actually, right? So, spending actually includes the increase in the run-up in debt and unfunded liabilities. So here's a graph that just shows government spending across countries over time. So I've taken 5 of the G7 countries, and I've taken Israel and added it to the graph. And here's what you see. Okay, so the top line, green line, top line is France. And France has had, for the last couple of decades, has had government spending to GDP of about 55%. So for most of you, you would say, based on your answers to the first poll question, that this is no longer, what was not really ever, based on this time series, a free market economy. But what's interesting is, actually, for most of you, remember on that first question, the modal answer was around a third, was around 33%. And none of these countries is below a third. So what that seems to say is that for most of you would say that this is not actually, most of these countries are not free market economies under your definition. Interesting to look also at how things have sort of evolved over time. I think, the one that's had the biggest kind of drift up from the others would be the United Kingdom, which started out being about the same level as the United States in 1995, between 35 and 40%, and ended up at 45% in 2021. And what has come down the most? Well, Israel has come down the most. So Israel used to have a much higher level of government expenditures as a share of GDP, and at over 50%. And even in 2021, where spending was still elevated, has gone down to be around 40%. So Israel has definitely reduced the size of government spending relative to the others. The United States and the United Kingdom have increased. And these are usually the countries that you think of as free market economies. But apparently, based on your answers, you might think of them as being larger than what you would think of as a free market economy. All right, so how does the government actually fund current period spending? There are 4 ways that they fund current period spending. One is through raising taxes. Okay, so you can raise taxes on income or value-added tax, consumption taxes. Second is public services fees. So there are many public services that if you consume them, like if you ride on public transport or you study in a university, there's usually some fees that are associated with that. The government is acting in some ways as a business. There is what's called seigniorage, which is the one that people are usually kind of the least familiar with. That's printing money, essentially. I mean, you could just think of that as the government can print money and spend it, and then they're financing current period spending that way. And then there's, of course, borrowing. So let's look at how the countries have evolved over time, not only in their spending, but also in their levels of debt, and how much of that spending has been financed with current resources instead of borrowing. So essentially, the government deficit, tells you how much has been financed with those first 3 methods, as opposed to that final method, which is borrowing. And what we see here again is, okay, so here's the red line is the United States. I try to keep the colors consistent throughout the presentation. The red line is the United States. And the United States in 2021 had a deficit, general government deficit, of around over 13% of GDP. And so if you look at where Israel is in that graph, Israel had a large deficit in 2020 as well, like the other countries, but is back. Is there anything we can do about the feedback? Is back to around 5% of 5% of GDP in 2021. And so the gray line, what's the gray line? The gray line is Germany, which has undertaken, all the European countries, has undertaken the most measures to try to put the government finances more in balance. So, so essentially what you've got, from the perspective of spending and then from the perspective of the deficit is, your spending as a share of GDP in Israel is lower than that of these 5 of the G7 countries. And your general government deficit is also lower and is closer to Germany. And that's also reflected in what's going on with the general government debt here. So if you look at the red line, that's the United States. General government debt has now gone up to over 140%, bumped up to over 140% of GDP, came down a little bit in 2021. Not much distinguishing, not much air there between the United States and France in terms of debt to GDP. But Israel is down here with Germany as a lower level of general government debt. And as we were talking about in the poll question before, if you include all unfunded obligations, such as Social Security and Medicare, the United States total debt is $79.5 trillion, or around 290% of GDP. So putting that all together in context, not only are the governments that we looked at here spending more than what most of you would think of as being consistent with a free market economy, they've also financed that by loading most of it, a big piece of it, onto future generations, future taxpayers. So if you think about what is economic freedom? The economic freedom is that the government's controlling a larger percent of the economy than you think would be consistent with a free market economy. And you're also on the hook now. You are going to have to pay for not only the spending that the government continues to do going forward, but also the legacy spending that was done in the past. Okay, so that picture is often surprising to folks. I mean, you always hear that it's bad. Government finances are bad or there are problems. But I think the sort of bright aspect of it is that Israel is in a better financial situation than a lot of its peers, and even when you think about the defense needs of Israel now and going forward, I think that still remains the case. So there was a lot of discussion about this last night, what the increase in defense spending that Israel will have to undertake now because of the current war and the increase in defense spending that it often has to undertake in such crises. This just compares the composition of government spending of Israel versus the United States. And the categories, these are the IMF categories, so they tend to be things like social protection, health, education, general public services, defense. So in the US, and the US numbers are, for various reasons, a bit lagged. It's hard for it's interesting, the government agencies, it's difficult for them to compile these stats for the US because the US has such a complex federalist system with different levels of government. We have the federal government, we have the state government, we have the local governments, and actually adding all that stuff up is fairly complex. But defense is, of course, a federal expenditure. United States, 7.5% of government expenditures, whereas in Israel in 2022 it was 13% of government expenditures. Sure to be much higher, 20% or more in 2023 or 2024. But the point is that the difference between those two, that 5.5%, even though Israel, due to its special situation, has to come up with more defense spending as a percentage of their budget and also as a percentage of GDP, nonetheless has managed to keep its finances in better shape than that of the United States. Yeah. Yeah.
How much is it? How much percentage is out of the GDP? Because even though they pay about the same amount of how much they expend in total, it might be way less than the percentage of the GDP.
So it's more than, I don't know the U.S. number off the top of my head, but in Israel it is more. Particularly when you think about what we heard last night was the 9% of GDP number as being the sort of longer-term steady state that was in place for Israel. It's declined in recent years, and is going to go back up towards that. So even as a percentage of GDP, it ends up being more in Israel. I don't have the U.S. number off the top of my head, but that's a good question. Yes?
Now, the defense spending in the States is less than half.
Less than that, 3.5%. Okay.
It's like an all-time low.
Bob's got the number off the top of his head. Okay, excellent. All right, great. So, so that's a bit of a comparison there. Now, how satisfied are people with the non-defense public services in the United States? I mean, if we're not spending that much of our GDP or of our government budget on defense, what are we spending? And a lot of it are these public medical programs and public social protection programs, which include Social Security. So our retirement and our health programs. I mean, health there at 22% of the expenditures are Medicare and Medicaid programs. And in both the U.S. and also the U.K., which is another place where there'd be a similar weight on non-defense public services, satisfaction is pretty low. So in the U.S., 45% of people are dissatisfied with Social Security and Medicare, and fewer than 1 in 4 British citizens are happy with the National Health Service. When you think about this, this is actually really pretty stunning because these programs are known to be financially totally unsustainable. Medicare is one of the biggest unfunded parts of that $79.5 trillion of unfunded liabilities. So what that means is that people right now are actually getting a bargain on these programs. They're actually paying in less than what it costs to provide those programs, and they're still super dissatisfied with the programs. What does the future hold? The future has to hold either higher levels of taxes to pay for the programs or lower levels of services, or both. So it seems very unlikely that going forward, satisfaction is going to increase with these programs when those changes that are going to be necessary to be made get made. And when you ask Americans how they would want to pay for better outcomes, 86% of them say they would love to see taxes raised, but only 12% say they think taxes should be raised on quote-unquote people like them. And that's you might think, okay, well, why is that a problem? Can't we just tax the rich? The rich are out there. We'll just tax the rich. Or tax the top 1%, for example, or tax people who earn more than $1 million a year. I mean, if you tax people who earn more than $1 million a year in the United States, we did these calculations when I was at the Council of Economic Advisors in Washington. You could only collect around $1 trillion, $1.3 trillion per year if you confiscated all of the income of people earning more than $1 million per year. And believe me, if you say you're going to confiscate all of their income, suddenly they're not going to be generating that much income. They're not going to be millionaires anymore all of a sudden because they're going to move elsewhere. They're going to find other ways they're going to find ways to shelter their income. You're not going to be able to do it. So, and that's just not enough. The kind of Medicare for all types of programs that get proposed in the United States will cost an additional $3 or $3.5 trillion per year just for that. Yeah.
Do you think there's like any merit to the case about like the problematic model where the insurance companies are the mediators between the government spending and the citizen getting the service, and they get kind of big profits out of it, which some say are like, this is why no one feels like they're getting a bargain. The government spends a lot, the citizen doesn't get great service. Do you do this model? Is there any?
I mean, there's certainly a lot of inefficiency, let's put it that way. And one area of the inefficiency that you point out is that there are these intermediaries, these insurance companies that are taking a big piece of the pie. The problem is those insurance companies are actually, they're doing something that the government is not itself that good at doing. And do we really believe that if we then made those services, so that thing being determining what services are covered, what are not covered, things like that, if we made that a government program where we'd be able to make these programs more efficient. I kind of doubt it, although I do generally think it surely would be possible to make government programs more efficient. Although I think maybe the direction you want to go in is more private provision of the things. But I think the general point is that this should raise questions in our mind as to whether does it really make sense, given the dissatisfaction with the government providing these programs, does it really make sense that the government is continuing to do so much in areas like these but also other ones that we'll talk about in a few minutes, like education and infrastructure. And the other point about this is for countries that have bigger, even bigger social medical programs, France, for example, those countries, that's usually financed via value-added tax, which is paid for by a very, very large and broad tax base, large number of people. And so this is sort of dreaming. This is not going to work, right? If they think it's going to be paid for with better outcomes, there just isn't the money there to just only tax people who are not like the people in the poll. So how big should government be? So I want to outline and critically assess some of the motivations for government spending. So these are the four big ones, and I think they're all potentially valid, but they are all also subject, well, except for A, I think they are all subject to the potential for overreach. So A is the protection of private property and the enforcement of contracts, which has been known for centuries to be a vital function of government. If you don't have that working, lots of stuff is not going to work. B, social safety net and poverty alleviation. All right, so that's a generally accepted role of government. The question is, how big is the safety net? How much do you need? Third is providing public goods when there are market failures. The question is, how often do you have these market failures? So people will often say, well, in the healthcare market, health insurance or healthcare market, we would have these market failures, so we need the government to get involved. Education, we'd have a market. Market failures, the market wouldn't provide it on its own, so we need the government to get involved. How true is that? Infrastructure, how true is that? How big is that market failure? D is smoothing over economic shocks, which the US government and the governments of the world have done a lot over the last couple of decades. A lot of smoothing over of economic shocks. Great financial crisis, big economic shock, we need to spend $1 trillion. COVID-19, big economic shock, we need to spend $6 trillion. So there's a lot of smoothing over of these shocks. How valid is that? How productive is that? How useful is that? How much of it needs to be done? As an aside, another one is what I call pure redistribution, which is, the government decides that, person A makes too much money and person B doesn't make enough money, so we're just going to tax person A and give money to person B. And I'm going to talk about that. That's going to be the topic of the other lecture that I'll give on Wednesday, inequality and pure redistribution. But that's also another justification for government involvement. So let's talk about some of these. So rule of law, protection of private property, and enforcement of private contracts. There's a long tradition of philosophers studying and thinking about these things. Hobbes wrote about the state of nature, and the state of nature, there's just total chaos. There's no place for industry because the fruit of it is uncertain. So why would you, start a business if you had no way of knowing that somebody else or some government or some army wouldn't come along and expropriate that business? You wouldn't start it. Yeah.
Just to clarify, when you say private contracts, are you also referring to Hobbes' social contracts, or?
Referring to private contracts. So, what have you got in mind?
Is in, because when you talk about the rule of law, then that has a lot to do with the social contracts we have about not killing a person. You have to be able to enforce that.
Yes, yeah.
So that's what I mean. Is it also enforcement of social contracts?
Yes, in the sense that your life is your property. Yes, I think you can. As an economist, I feel like you can all fit it sort of into a private property type of context. But there is, there is a certain rule of law, meaning that there are certain laws that aren't going to be broken. Theft. No theft, no murder, things like that. So that was the Hobbes worry that you needed. And what is that? Hobbes said you needed this Leviathan, this creature to. This is the illustration of the Leviathan. Come in and create order, because otherwise there won't be no ability to reap the fruits of your own labor. Next, I think in this, there are many steps of this intellectual progression, but the answer of John Locke was that government, you don't need a Leviathan, you don't need this huge overbearing creature. Instead, government can be limited to just protecting a few natural rights, life, liberty, and property. And that if the government protected life, liberty, and property, then it would be doing what it needed to do in order to have a society where there would be place for industry, because the fruit thereof would not be uncertain. So you don't actually need this huge overbearing state. But how much protection do we need? And, well, I guess as an economist, I think economists have the answer to everything. So it's kind of funny maybe just for you to see the intellectual progression from Hobbes and his Leviathan to John Locke to a University of Chicago economist named Ronald Coase. But I really do see it there. Okay, so Coase wrote a very famous paper. He won the Nobel Prize for this idea of the problem of social cost. And he framed this problem as a problem of one where one agent's actions impose negative externalities on someone else, such as via noise or pollution, as an example. And I'll give a more precise example in a minute. But the old solution was that you needed laws to be passed to protect those who suffer the negative externalities. So, well, you know, the one example that I'll give in a second is the construction of, say, the construction of windmills for the production of wind energy, electricity. Those, wherever you put them, they're going to create noise and disruption for the people where you put them. And so the old solution would have been that those people would have gone to their local governments and said, we want you to make sure that these companies don't build windmills near us, because that's going to create negative externalities for us. We don't want it, and we're going to lobby the government not to do that, to make sure that those companies don't do it. Well, what's the Coasean solution? The Coase solution is that the government's role is to make it legally clear and enforceable who has what rights, and then the parties will bargain to an efficient solution. So what does that look like in my wind example here? Here's the Coase theorem at work. Okay, so this is a story from about 10 years ago, but an issue that is still being studied actively now, including by a colleague of mine at the Hoover Institution, in fact, specifically this question of what happens when wind turbines are too loud. So this was covered in the New York Times. A wind turbine company built loud turbines near residents in a rural area of the U.S. state of Oregon. Oregon law actually gives residents the right to peace and quiet. That's written into the state law of the state. And that's the thing about the United States. We have these 50 states, and they all have sort of funny laws. But in Oregon, you have the right to peace and quiet. So the residents could have gone to the state government and complained and said, this company is violating our right to peace and quiet. We want you to shut them down. But what happened was the wind turbine company offered to pay the residents to deal with the noise in exchange for signing a waiver promising that they would not complain to the authorities. So they sought a solution where they would compensate the residents for the disruption that they were incurring. And they didn't force anybody to sign any contracts, but the contracts were signed in the shadow of the Oregon law, where the people knew that they had the right to peace and quiet. So on average, people got about $5,000. Of course, the mechanism of how you do this matters a lot. But why is this a better solution than just letting the residents go and complain? What do we get out of this that we wouldn't get if the residents just go and complain? We get energy, right? We actually get construction of electricity generating assets, these windmills, that we wouldn't otherwise have. And so this is my justification for why I actually do think that the Coase theorem is in a direct intellectual line from Hobbes and then John Locke, which is that here is the mechanism. All the government has to do is guarantee life and property. And as long as you have an economy where property rights are properly specified, you'll end up with situations where people can write contracts. As long as those contracts are enforceable by law, you'll end up with a more efficient outcome. So, so markets and property rights are important. If it weren't clear who had the property rights, the fact that the Oregon law gave residents the right to peace and quiet actually was productive in this situation, because it provided the setting for the bargaining that the company would do with the people who were affected. Here's an example of what happens when confidence in markets and property rights is lost. Here's Venezuela. So I think Venezuela has had two major rounds of extremely disruptive economic or general policy in the last several decades. People are probably most familiar in their minds with Maduro and the most recent one. But if you go back to the 1990s, this kind of slide began when Hugo Chavez was elected in 1998. Revolutionary left-wing populist. His political platform was to move away from a free market economy towards greater centralized control. Investors became concerned about market conditions and how safe their investments would be, and of course, foreign investment then declined very, very rapidly. Just to illustrate, this is a picture of a man in his store before the election, and this is a picture of the same man after the election, a couple of years after the election, after the effects of this moving away from a free market economy to greater centralized control had taken place. So here's what happened to foreign direct investment around that time. So it was going up. Hugo Chavez gets elected, and it then proceeds to decline. So nobody wants to invest. Why would you want to invest in an economy, invest in a place, if you didn't think that your investments would be protected, if you thought that your investments might be expropriated by the government? So rule of law, protection of private property, enforcement of private contracts. Little question that this is a very, very important function of government, and one that should be focused on. If you don't have functioning courts, this can be a real problem. So there are, and this is going to affect things like innovation. It's going to affect business starts. And some countries around the world, I think, are probably held back by a lack of functioning of their ability to enforce contracts. I think India being one of them. India is a place with like tremendous innovation, lots of resources, still tremendous amount of poverty. Very, very hard to get a contract enforced in India. You know, it's going to take you years to get a contract enforced. If you sign a contract somebody violates, it's going to take you years. Whereas in the United States, the courts are relatively efficient. Although when you look at all the things the United States spends money on, and when you experience, if you ever have to experience the legal system in a country like the United States, you realize that there's a lot more efficiency that could be brought to that process as well. Okay, so second of the four roles of government I wanted to go through is the social safety net and poverty alleviation. So this is the idea that the government is there, you know, to ensure that people are not living in extreme poverty, are not dying on the streets and things like that. So U.S. federal government has played an increasing anti-poverty role. It's interesting if you think about the history of this. Until 1913, the U.S. government had no federal income tax. And the U.S. government was really the federal government was really a very, very small percentage of the economy. Starting in the 19 teens, so we're talking like 110 years ago, the United States started putting in a federal income tax, used a lot of that to pay for World War I, kept a lot of the structure in place, and then during the Great Depression, the United States put in these large anti-poverty programs. The New Deal is kind of the catchphrase for all of the 1930s spending programs, including the Social Security Act of 1935, which created Social Security, our national pension system, if you will, unemployment insurance, and some other programs. So Social Security, when it was started, this national pension system, it didn't start out in the idea that, like, you might think of, if you're going to start preparing for your own retirement, you might say, okay, I'm going to start saving. No, Social Security said, we're going to start paying people retirement pensions right away, older people. We're going to start collecting taxes from younger people. We're just going to spend the money right away. So it's the money that Social Security takes in from younger people, they're basically paying out directly to retirees. Over time, sometimes there are periods where a buffer gets built up, and then there are periods where that buffer gets expired and where it's running negative. Right now with Social Security in the United States, a buffer has been built up, but that buffer is going to expire, is going to run out in 2033, which is a year that people have been talking about for a while, but now suddenly it feels like it's a lot closer than it was when people started talking about it. But what that means when that buffer runs out is that the money that's coming in from the receipts, the payroll taxes, is not going to be enough to pay the benefits that people have been promised. So something has got to give there. So the 1930s, big increase in the social safety net in the U.S. 1960s, another big one with the creation of these public medical programs, Medicare and Medicaid. And then in the 1990s, and also very recently, there have been a number of expansions to public benefits, particularly child tax credits and in 2021, an expansion of that to being a monthly allowance. So, so this is viewed as being having a social safety net is, of course, important, right? I mean, there are people in society who are just not going to be able to provide for themselves. The elderly, the disabled. That's a role, a philosophical role of government and a practical role of government that's very important. But, and this is the thing I want to try to add to the discussion, that incentives are also a major issue. People consider their marginal tax rate, which is the rate that an additional dollar they earn will be taxed, in deciding whether to work or whether to work more. And you know, if you think about labor force participation in the U.S., that is not recovered from the COVID-19 crisis all the way back to where it started. And you ask the question, what role did government economic policy play? And you might be thinking, okay, the poor, do poor people really consider their marginal tax rate? I mean, they go and they say, oh, I'm going to fill out a tax form at the end of the year. Well, that's not exactly how it works, but this is how it works. So this is an example from, it varies state by state in the US. So there's the federal programs and the state programs on top of it, but these numbers would be for somebody in Chicago, Illinois. Okay, so single mother of two who makes $12 per hour or $22,000 per year. So that's, you know, going to be very hard to support a family of two on that amount of money. Employer decides to offer this person a promotion and a pay raise to $18 per hour or $33,000 in net pay. So the question I'm asking is, would it be wise, would you advise the single mother of two under the current system in the US to accept the promotion? And the first thing you might be thinking is, well, it seems very obvious. They're getting a 50% raise. Why would you not? Well, it turns out that their marginal tax rate in this situation is over 100%. And how does that work? So here's the salary change: $22,000 at $12 per hour, $33,000 at $18 per hour. But the part of it that you have to take into account is these are the benefits that the individual gets from all of the various programs that they are going to be eligible for, right? So if you look here, you see that they're eligible for $39,534 in benefits if they're earning only $22,000 per year. But that eligibility goes away almost entirely if they earn $33,000 per year. They only are eligible for $5,000 in benefits. So what are these benefits? These are things like additional child tax credits, refundable earned income tax credits. And in fact, if you walk, I was referring before to the question of do lower income people, are they really getting these tax credits? Are they aware of this stuff? I mean, I worked at the University of Chicago for a number of years. I lived in Chicago. If you walk into poor neighborhoods of Chicago, you sometimes see on a set of street corners, you'll see a payday loan place, a liquor store, and an H&R Block office. H&R Block is a major tax preparer. So literally, they go in there, and these offices are there to help people get tax benefits. In fact, people do take major advantage of these tax benefits. What other benefits do you lose? Well, there's food stamps, which are nutritional assistance programs. There's a program called Women, Infants, and Children. There's a national school lunch program. There's a housing assistance for the Housing Choice Voucher program. There are all of these programs. And so by accepting this promotion, the single mother of two would actually be doing something that would be detrimental to her and her family. And so if I were advising this person under the current system, should you take this promotion, I would actually have to say, I don't think you should. Yeah?
And the program changes when she crosses the 30,000 a year?
It's not, it's gradual, right? So there are many different, all the programs I mentioned all have different rules. So this is just modeling from, somebody who happens to earn 22,000, somebody who happens to earn 32,000. But that is a range in which there is a lot of phase out of these programs. Yeah.
If I understand correctly, this is a state-dependent system. So food stamps and can even be dependent on the municipality of the person. So my question is, whether is there any way to integrate the state, the federal, and the municipal system of taxes to make these peculiarities go?
So some of it is state, but the vast majority of these numbers are federal. That's one thing I wanted to say. So the programs I mentioned, the food stamps, the earned income tax credit, women, infants, and children, these are federal programs. Most of this is federal, but if you dig into these exact numbers, there are a couple of state programs in here as well. So it is actually fairly integrated, and the biggest piece of this is actually the federal programs. But different states do offer different types of benefits to people, and you do have a situation where a state like California, Illinois as well, offer pretty generous additional benefits in the form of usually housing support. That's where a lot of it comes from, is support for low-income housing. And so you see that in those places, the incentive to actually take up these better economic opportunities is even lower.
Yeah, but what if a state is not directly concerned with how much federal government has in tax?
Right.
So, they may just optimize their local interests.
Yes. Well, and this is always the challenge with thinking about the United States and its highly decentralized system, is that there are reasons for economic efficiency why you might want things to be federalized, centralized. But there are also reasons where different locations might have different preferences or different problems that you might want to have control. So that's a real point of contention and discussion in the U.S. about centralization versus decentralization, and gets into many other topics, including things like housing. I think as in Israel, housing is really expensive in the United States. A lot of that has to do with localities placing control over how much new supply of housing can be built at the local level. And there's always talk about trying to take a more higher level approach and say, no, we're not going to allow those types of restrictions because we want more housing nationally. But then local places say we have our own. So lots of trade-offs there, I think, in the centralizing versus decentralizing debate. So how large of a problem is poverty in developed countries? Well, I wanted to do something where we could compare across countries. So according to the World Bank definition, the percentage of people whose income falls below $5.50 per day in purchasing power was one of their main definitions of poverty. So if you look at where that definition of poverty would fall, in the United States, you only have 2% of people who fall under that definition. Israel used to be higher and now has actually come down a lot. For comparison, India has a poverty rate of 83%. Now, housing, other things are much more expensive in countries like the United States than they are in India. So this World Bank approach of using a sort of flat level of income could be problematic. But there are other measures that you can look at, like things, there's something called material deprivation. How many of a list of 10 things that people should be able to do, like have shelter and have food, things like that, can they not do? And even there, in the developed countries, the amount of poverty that exists right now, it varies across countries, but it would be hard to say that any of the statistics support there being a lot of poverty in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom. On the other hand, you have what you do see in the United States, United Kingdom, and Israel is you see a lot of venture capital funding and a lot of startup entrepreneurship per capita. So this is a startup ecosystem report that tries to rank the amount of global startup activity that there is, startup activity there is by country. Also have venture capital funding per country, and you see Israel, venture capital funding per capita by country, you see Israel very high there. So there is some trade-off of economic dynamism and providing, seeking equality. And I think that's important to keep in mind as we think about these models and we think about the social safety net. And also, what are the incentives for people to actually start things on their own, do things on their own, or even take jobs and promotions?
What was?
Yeah.
I don't get a connection between the right and the left.
So the left is just a startup ecosystem report where they attempt to grade countries on a number of different criteria about how easy it is to start a business, how easy it is to get the permits you need to start a business, how many startups are created. And the right is venture capital funding. And the reason that the ranking is going to vary is that it takes more than just venture capital. So venture capital is neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition to have a startup, to start a business. Venture capital is just equity funding from from investors that are providing providing VC. There are many other ways. You can start a business with friends and family money. You can start a business with angel money. You can start a business by taking out a bank loan. So left is just general business starting, and the right is equity capital from VCs in particular. That helps. So the third area, provision of public services due to market failures. The third justification for government spending or government intervention. And the motivation for most of the government activities is the claim that the private economy cannot or will not provide them. So definition of a public good, which any of you who've taken economics have heard the definition of a public good, which is a good that's non-rivalrous and non-excludable. So non-rivalrous means that my consumption of it does not crowd out your consumption of it, and non-excludable means that when it's provided, if I provide it, I can't stop someone else from consuming it. So when you have those two conditions, as you do in national defense, then you would say that that's a public good. You're going to have to provide that through the government, because otherwise the individual incentive to provide it is limited due to its non-excludability, and the individual incentive to consume it is unlimited because of the fact that it's not rivalrous. So you then have these situations where the government. So I think people almost universally agree that national defense is a public good that has to be arguments, particularly in the context of the United States, that states should do national defense as opposed to the federal government. But I won't go there. But more generally, what are the goods and services that have externalities associated with them that private agents don't internalize? So we see the government active in health and education, in transportation infrastructure, and there's often an assumption that the government has to provide those things. But how extensive would the market failures really be if they were provided privately? So here are these three areas, right? So public model versus a private model, and I think that, the U.S. and many countries are some hybrid of these. So for education in the United States, K through 12 public education, that's elementary through high school education, is generally provided by the public, by local governments. Actually, it's usually at the municipal level. There are private schools in the United States, but based on stats I've seen, only about 5 to 10% of students in the United States attend a private school. So education is an area where you can have some hybrid between things. It's also possible to have what's called a voucher system, where you have school choice. You have government-funded schools, but parents can choose where to send their kids, and schools that get more enrollment end up receiving, under a formula, receiving more financial support from the state or local government. Healthcare. So in the United States, we have Medicare for the elderly, Medicaid for the poor. That's a system of public insurance. We've also got private insurance markets for everybody else, albeit with significant government intervention. There are also some institutions in the United States that operate on a non-insurance basis. So there's a famous place. Actually, Russ Roberts has done a great podcast. Well, you probably know Russ Roberts' podcast. Russ Roberts is the president of Reichman University. Shalom College, right? Shalom College. And but he's also a great podcaster and presenter interviewer of economists, and he's got this fascinating set of hundreds and hundreds of podcasts in his library of liberty. Well, one of my favorite episodes is where he interviews the head of the Oklahoma Surgery Institute. So Oklahoma is a state in the middle of the United States, They have it's a private institute, and they do surgical procedures. They post all their prices, and they don't take insurance. And it turns out that a lot of people use this, and in some cases they find that even people with insurance find that after all of their own copays and deductibles under the insurance system, plus the fact that they can't go and choose their own doctors necessarily, that actually having a procedure like a hip replacement or something where they have a specific, posted price on that website, having it done by this private provider of health insurance is actually more cost effective and better for them than going through the insurance system, even for people who have insurance. You also have in the United States a lot of people who, for medical procedures, even if they have insurance, they will go to Mexico to get medical procedures done. Because in the United States, it's so expensive that even after the insurance is kicked in, what's left with their copays and their deductibles, what they have to fund, makes it so that it would be cheaper to go get the procedure in Mexico. So when you have people who are choosing to seek alternative, privately provided medical care outside of the public system, outside even of the private insurance system, you have to wonder whether there is maybe more of a role for purely privately provided services on health. Infrastructure is another one. So the public model would be that highways and streets, sewer and water system, police and fire services are provided by the public. Private model, and that's the way it is in the United States. Private model in the United States, we have freight railways, pipelines, telecommunications networks, utilities, power stations, private but highly regulated. So let me just dig into the education one just a little bit and also the infrastructure one. So Milton Friedman, famous University of Chicago economist and sort of an inspiration to a lot of those of us who work in the free market space, famously wrote an essay on the role of government education and proposed this idea of school choice programs, the idea that that school districts could offer families, offer parents the opportunity to choose where to send their kids to school, and funding would in some way, through a variety of different types of mechanisms, would follow that. So this has been tried all over the United States in many, many places, and pretty much every study that looks at school choice finds a positive impact. I think I'll just take the latest ones here. The cutting edge is Los Angeles, the map of Los Angeles. Created zones of choice. So they overlaid on top of the map zones in which families could choose whatever school they wanted to in the zone to send their kids to. And they found big improvements in test scores and college attainment. And they had a mechanism where funding would then follow so that schools that got a lot of students would get additional resources. And if you look at papers on school choice, 20 of 21 studies that have been done that use careful experimental designs found very positive effects of school choice programs on test score performance. So that's kind of a hybrid model where funding follows where parents choose to send their kids, and it's in contrast to this sort of pure local school model where people just send their kids to a local school. You have to send them to the local school, and you have no other choice. Infrastructure. So this is another one you might have read about this recently. The top picture there is the bridge that collapsed in Baltimore, Maryland, when a ship ran into it. And it's kind of not surprising that bridges collapse in the U.S. This is one where no ship ran into it. This was in Pennsylvania a couple of years ago. Overpass just collapsed. A lot of talk about how bad our infrastructure is. The Society for Civil Engineers gave the United States a grade of C- for the current state of its infrastructure. Some people like to dismiss that report and say, yeah, the engineers just want to give us a bad grade so they can get the business of redesigning the new infrastructure. I mean, you always wonder who wrote the report. But I think it's pretty valid and has been supported by what happens, that many roads are in poor, mediocre condition, and this has remained unchanged. You have hundreds of thousands of bridges in the United States that still need to be repaired. And what's going on? I mean, why is infrastructure so bad in the U.S. in particular, especially given all the money that we throw at it? We have problems where just creating building small amounts of infrastructure seems to cost billions and billions of dollars, and economists are still working on trying to understand why that is. In my hometown of Boston, they extended a subway line by 2.5 miles, and it ended up costing over $1 billion per mile, and it was done on existing track. So often you have problems with requirements that very expensive labor that already has a union contract with the state be employed. You have problems with excessive red tape in place to try to block a new infrastructure. So it tends to be very expensive. But the problem I want to highlight here is that if you look at roads, if you look at rail in the United States, you look at airports in the United States, very, very little private activity. It's all done by government. Whereas if you look at Europe, European roads, European rail, European airports, they're private. So how can this be that in the United States, where people think about this as being this free market economy, and Europe, where you have France with 55% of GDP as government spending, you have more private provision of infrastructure? Well, in the United States, we have a system where states can issue bonds, they can borrow money on very, very tax preferential terms. So investors in state government bonds don't have to pay taxes on the interest they receive from those bonds. And that means that states and cities can raise money really, really cheaply. And it puts them on at a great advantage relative to private providers of infrastructure. So, if you look at any infrastructure that gets built in the United States, most likely it's done by a state or local government. There isn't much of a role for the private sector. Other areas where the private sector has played a big role in the United States is an area like broadband access. So broadband access is something that's left to the public. Telecommunications infrastructure, is left to the private sector. There you've seen tons of investment in broadband, in telecommunications infrastructure, with millions of homes getting broadband and the price decreasing. So I think looking at where are the industries and where are the sectors, where are the countries where the private sector has played a role, what you see is that those are areas where you get a lot of mileage for the money that you invest in infrastructure. In areas where there's some reason that the government has to control it, you get worse stuff. It's a similar thing with airports. I don't know when the last time was you flew through a U.S. airport, but every time I fly from the United States someplace else, the other country's airports look better and seem to work better. And again, it turns out, actually, there's some economists who have written a paper just about privatization of airports and comparing the public versus private status to airport performance, things like delays, quality of the infrastructure, and so on. And the main finding is that privatized airports have much better service, much better financial outcomes as well. Also depends on what type of investor is in there. But one of the big sort of broad takeaways is that in the United States, there are no privatized airports. There's no private participation in airports, whereas in Europe, pretty much every airport you go to has got some private component. Okay, so government tools for smoothing shocks. So this is the fourth one that I wanted to talk through. The fourth justification for government intervention. Typically think of two tools for stabilizing the economy. One is fiscal policy. That means taxing and spending. So the idea behind fiscal policy is that when demand in the economy is weak, the government can borrow money and spend it, stimulating the economy. Everybody learns this in kind of Econ 101. When the economy is very strong, the idea is that the government is then supposed to increase taxes and pay down the debt. Well, that hasn't worked very well, right? We just see a ratcheting up of the amount of debt. When the economy is weak, the government spends and borrows a lot of money. When the economy is strong, it just kind of keeps spending money. It never actually seems to be raising enough revenue to be able to keep its debt burden stable. So that's one area, fiscal policy. Other area is monetary policy, where the central bank changes the money supply or controls interest rates in order to try to maintain stable prices and achieve full employment. So there are a lot of misconceptions around these methods. These come straight into Econ 101. In the United States, a lot of public schools to actually teach economics in high school. So when my high school age kid started bringing his homework home and showing me what he was learning in economics, I mean, I was kind of horrified. One of the things that is emphasized very much is this idea of the Keynesian multiplier. So this is John Maynard Keynes, very famous British economist who kind of, to many, revolutionized the study of modern macroeconomics. But I think he really messed up a lot of things. So basic hypothesis is that government spending of $1,000 generates GDP of more than $1,000, because the idea is the government spends it, they might buy services from you, you then take the money from that and spend it on something else, and that person then spends it on something else, and then you get this multiplier effect. So $1 of government spending or $1,000 of government spending somehow generates GDP of more than $1,000, and this is just baked into every economics curriculum. This is, people treat this as though it's just truth. It's like a law of gravity. Yeah.
Equally correct. The context of change was the big threat. So
Was what? Was it?
The
Great Depression, yes.
So I'm not sure that originally you meant that this rule applies to all the economic times. But of course, politicians only have for reason to use it in the full economic time.
Indeed. The research tries to separate out what the multiplier is during recessions versus non-recessions, and finds multipliers of 1 to 2, so definitely more than 1, but as high as 2 during a recession. The question ends up being the causality of that, right? Because there's just there are ebbs and flows. The economy grows, the economy goes through periods of slower growth, and there's no real way of knowing whether the spending that the government did actually created that additional GDP, or if it was just an economic recovery that would have happened anyway. But I think you're right. He thought about it as being something that would be relevant during recessions, and government investment gets even more justification. So the idea of public infrastructure that's supposed to increase these returns to private capital. But there are problems. So there are conceptual problems. So one conceptual problem is that people are forward-looking, and attempts to give people money to spend it don't always work. People don't always spend it. Oftentimes, they'll do things like paying down debt with it. Long preceding Keynes, the economist Ricardo said that if people are forward-looking, then if you finance government spending with current taxes, then that's going to have the same effect on the economy as financing with current deficits. And why is that? Because people are, to some extent, forward-looking. So the Ricardo model, the question for Keynes is, who buys the government bonds that finance the spending, right? So if the government has to borrow $1,000 to spend it, under the idea that that's then going to stimulate economic activity, somebody has to come up with $1,000 to buy those bonds, and that's $1,000 that would not otherwise have been spent. So that's something that has never been answered, right? So the idea is, if the government takes on debt, somebody's got to buy that debt, and then people are thinking, okay, what's going to happen to taxes in the future? So they might not actually spend money, and then instead they'll just do what they did during the pandemic, which is to stay at home and watch Netflix, to which they had a subscription anyway. So no additional stimulus really happened. People called the money that the federal government gave people during COVID, they called it stimulus checks. But what did people actually do with the money? Well, first of all, initially, they didn't do much with the money. So only 15% of the COVID-19 stimulus checks, only 15% of the recipients reported that they spent their payments in the United States. Most said they either saved it or used it to pay down debt. So it didn't stimulate the economy at that time. It probably did later on. Whether it did more than 1 for 1 is very hard to say. Also, there's a great paper from Israel where 57% of households who received COVID grants mostly paid down their debts or just saved the money. And in fact, in the United States, savings rates during COVID, during this time where the government thought we're giving people money that they need, went up to around over 30%. So people were saving over 30%. And of course, a lot of that came back later on when people started spending it, and it drove up a lot of inflation. So this just shows you during the COVID time, right? So the blue line is personal consumption expenditures. The red line is the personal savings rate, and the other line is the federal debt to GDP. So essentially, the government just borrowed money, gave people the proceeds. People didn't spend it, and they used it to pay down debts. They saved it, and later they started trying to spend it, but at a time when they also didn't have an incentive to work, and so that created a bunch of inflation. Second problem with the Keynesian model is the crowding out of private activity. I mean, this has at least been recognized and modeled, but it's often forgotten or not covered in basic economics. I mean, I hope maybe you'll tell me that those of you who are taking basic economics that it was covered, but whenever I go through it, I hear people telling me, well, no, it wasn't really. We just kind of learned that when the government spends money, it's just like sprinkling magic fairy dust and just creates economic activity. But simple example of the crowding out, this is usually, maybe the other problem is this is usually taught with these very boring supply and demand graphs, and that's kind of, maybe doesn't make the point, but suppose you want to invest $100 in a new business, you have $40 on hand, and you want to borrow $60. But at the same time, the government decides it's going to borrow $70 to pay for goods and services that are not already covered by current tax revenues. So in that case, you'll have a total demand for borrowing for loanable funds of 60 plus 70, which is $130. Now, suppose that the funds are limited, and right now only $80 is currently available in the entire lending market, right? And so your desire to borrow 60 kind of was like a new desire that put you over the amount that's currently available. What's going to happen? Well, the first thing that's going to happen is interest rates are going to go up, because how else is the market going to decide how to allocate that 80 that's currently available? Then those higher interest rates might entice more providers of capital, so that 80 will probably grow to something, right? Grow to 100 or grow to 110. But in the end, you're going to look at those higher interest rates, and you're also probably going to borrow less than the 60 you'd initially planned and invest less in the business, because now interest rates are going to be higher. So government spending crowds out private activity through higher interest rates. I mean, there's no question that one of the reasons we're facing much higher interest rates now than we were 8 years ago is because of all of the government spending that has happened in the meantime. So something to be aware of. Yes, yeah.
Careful the claim that the desire to invest $100 in a new business in time of recession will be too low, and the government will make this desire come true only if it borrows those extra dollars. So it's more complex than the way it could.
Indeed, it is. Keynes is thinking of a time where there is some lack of demand. There is some shortfall in demand for some reason, and I guess I've never understood what that reason would need to be. I mean, and also I appreciate the way that he will look at that. But I actually think one of the big problems with the way that people learn economics is we learn what Keynes said instead of just thinking about what are the basic fundamentals that are going to be in place just under price theory, just under the basic theory of prices and how they operate. And so I think if we forget these mechanisms, we're going to often forget what the downside is of assuming that Keynesian economics works. Yeah?
Just one point to make about how this changes the mentality and culture of the country. So you talked about when Social Security was passed in 1936. So just looking here, in 1936, government spending as a percentage of GDP was 10%.
10%.
Now it's 25%. So there's
Federal government spending. Yeah.
There's been a fundamental change in what the public will accept with regard to the government. It's a dramatic change.
Well, the fact that the public accepts such, I mean, again, we started out with the poll, right? So apparently, according to everybody here, we don't have free market economies in these places, because the total, when you add up federal, state, and local, is 35 or 40%. And yeah, the sort of benchmark for what people find acceptable has changed, because I guess this happens without people really noticing. I mean, if you ask most people who haven't studied economics before, how much of the economy do you think the government controls in the United States? they're not going to tell you they think it's 40%. They're going to say it's something much lower. Also worth pointing out that that number, that percentage of the economy spent by the government, that doesn't take into account also all of the regulation that the government imposes on the private economy as well. So even the remaining 60% is not completely free of government intervention by any stretch. So one other topic I want to cover in the remaining time is the point about distortionary taxation. So people often assume that the government can just can raise money without there being any kind of negative impact on the economy. There's a famous quote from the very old French finance minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert: "The art of taxation consists in so plucking the goose as to get the largest quantity of feathers with the least amount of hissing." Okay, so what does that mean? The hissing is, the analogy is that if you tax something, you're going to get less of it. And so, for example, if you tax income enough, you will have less income generation. I mean, the example I gave before was, let's say you decide you want to fund Medicare by taxing people who earn more than $1 million a year, and you're going to just tax those people at 100% of every dollar they earn above $1 million because you believe that nobody should earn more than $1 million. Well, if you do that, very, very quickly you're going to find that there are just suddenly a lot fewer people earning $1 million than there were before, because why would you work and put in the effort if you knew that every dollar you earned above $1 million was going to be confiscated? So in some sense, the idea of distortionary taxation should be obvious in the sense that there is a level at which taxing people more, you will destroy economic activity. Some types of taxation are more distortionary than others. Milton Friedman was fond of saying that a property tax on unimproved land, or just a land tax, is the least bad tax. This goes back to an argument of Henry George from the late 19th century. And why is this not a distortionary tax if you tax land? Well, you know, the distortions are that if you tax something, you're going to get less of it. But if the land's already there, so there's not going to be any less of it in any sense. So taxes on unimproved land are perhaps the least distortionary. Doesn't affect the amount available. What about taxing consumption of a particular good or service? Well, you're going to get less of that, right? So the more you tax something, less you get. And this is the for taxes that are meant to correct negative externalities. This is viewed as being a feature, not a bug, right? So I mean, taxes on cigarettes are very high in a lot of countries. That's because the government wants to discourage smoking, and they also want to collect revenue. Similarly, people talk a lot about about carbon taxes, which exist in some countries. You want to discourage the burning of fossil fuels, so you levy a carbon tax. So that sort of intentionally leads to less consumption of that good and less supply. Tax on income. The problem with the tax on income is that it's inherently a tax on productive behavior, and there's a big debate in economics as to how important this really is, right? So, and this goes back to the implicit marginal tax on the person in Illinois who's considering going from $12 an hour to $18 an hour. That is an implicit tax of over 100% on their income because they lose resources by accepting a higher paying position. The person who's sort of most famously associated with this is a guy named Art Laffer. He's in his mid-80s now, but you can still see him on U.S. conservative news programming like Fox News. He showed originally the theoretical relationship between tax revenues and the tax rate, allegedly on a napkin that he drew. You know, he was sitting in a bar and drew it on a napkin, and then now here it is, you know, in everybody's economics presentations decades later. But he said that there is a relationship between tax revenues and the tax rate, so that if you increase the tax rate high enough, you will get to a point where you will actually have less revenue. You might think, well, that seems odd. How can it be if I'm taxing it, you know, 40% and then I raise the tax to 50%? Won't I get more revenue from doing that? Well, you know, under some circumstances you will, but if the distortionary effect on economic activity is enough, then you will end up getting less. So I think the example of the implementing a millionaire's tax where you confiscate the money, right? So in California, there is a millionaire's tax. Actually, in California, the top marginal income tax rate is 14.4%, in addition to the 37% federal income tax rate. People don't usually realize that. It sounds like a lot, right? But in fact, in California, for people who are, if you sell a business and that business was your life's work, and you realize a couple $1 million on that sale, the federal government will take 37% plus a Medicare surcharge, and the state government will take 14.4%. So we actually have tax rates of over 50% in a lot of the U.S. But maybe that still doesn't sound high enough. But of course, if California then went from saying we're going to do that to saying we're going to tax 100%, we're going to confiscate all income above $1 million, you surely would you would find that you were on the wrong side of the Laffer curve. In fact, I've done some research where I actually look at California tax returns. I got a contract with the California tax authorities to analyze the impacts of these high marginal income tax rates on people's economic activity. And I found that when they raised that top tax rate, originally to 13.3%, now 14.4%, they did bring in additional revenue. So they were not on the wrong side of the Laffer curve. However, that was at a time when there were a bunch of federal tax advantages for living in high tax states. You could deduct your state taxes on your federal tax return. That's no longer the case. And currently, I would say California may well be definitely on the flat part of this Laffer curve and possibly on the wrong side, because that's at the state level where people can maybe move, where they can shift their income elsewhere. National level, it's probably higher. So Trump gave him the congressional, or gave him the Presidential Medal of Honor, loved him. The New York Times wrote the dangerous folly of Lafferism. They didn't like it so much. But I have a different comment about the Laffer curve, though, that I think is important, which is that when Laffer did this, he started a whole discussion about where is the top of the Laffer curve. And he said that the top of the Laffer curve is much lower than other people think it is. He probably thinks it's much lower even than where any of the federal tax brackets are right now. And other economists came in and were willing to play the game of asking where's the top of the Laffer curve. The standard belief right now among economists who teach public finance and write about public finance from the U.S. perspective is that the optimal top marginal tax rate is, anybody want to guess what they say it is? The one that maximizes revenue. Yeah, 82%. 82%. Okay, so that's Emmanuel Saez, Peter Diamond, Nobel Prize winner, a professor of mine from MIT who I just saw last week, and a great and brilliant individual, but misguided on these things. Okay, so it's like
short time period. So if you increase the tax for the next 2 years, then you get the increase because this will not close tomorrow, but for a decade.
Well, that's a great point, and that might be one of the issues. I think the models they're looking at are not very dynamic models. In the work I did on California, I actually found that in the first year there was an erosion of around 30% of the expected windfall gains. By 3 years, it had gotten to be over 60%. So if it were going to be over the top of the Laffer curve, it would have to be over 100%. And it's possible that, the techniques I was using were ones that probably wouldn't have allowed you to go far enough out to be able to estimate that. So it could be a lack of considering longer term dynamics. And I think actually that's a very good point, because usually they're plugging in some parameters that are from some sort of poorly estimated empirical exercise that actually also only look at a short period of time. So that may very well be it. So these economists were willing to play the game and say, well, where is the top of the Laffer curve? We think the top of the Laffer curve is, we put in this estimated elasticity parameter and this assumed income distribution parameter. We get 82%. So then they, the sort of discussion has been, they say it's 82%. Other people say it's much lower, and that's been driving the discussion. But I fear that there's something that's really missing here, which is, what about overall production and overall prosperity? So before you get to the top of the Laffer curve, you've already discouraged a tremendous amount of economic activity. Asking the question that the Laffer curve asks is, will an additional percentage point of the tax rate, will that raise additional revenue or not? That's a really, really narrow question. If you're at the point where raising tax rates by 1% won't generate any more revenue, you've already distorted the economy by a tremendous amount. You've discouraged a ton of economic activity. So I feel like our profession should go back to the late Martin Feldstein, who was a Harvard University economics professor, and I think one of the last public finance professors who still really worked in this tradition. He asked the question, just for the current, or as of that time, the 1990s level of income taxation in the United States, how much lost economic activity do we have because of just the level that currently exists? And there he found that an increase in the personal income tax rate involved a deadweight loss, meaning foregone economic activity of $2 for every incremental dollar of increased revenue. Now, you can go to his study too, and you can debate about what parameters he put in. How'd you get $2 for every incremental dollar of increased revenue? Maybe it's not 2, maybe it's 150, or maybe it's even only 1. But the fact of the matter is that it is not 0, and therefore, by having a discussion totally about where is the top of the Laffer curve, we're kind of missing something really important, which is, how do we optimize prosperity? How do we maximize prosperity? How do we have a system that funds the basic needs of government, the basic things that government needs to function properly, while maximizing prosperity? And there, it would have to be much lower tax rates than we have already. Not because necessarily we're over the top of the Laffer curve, but because we're off on the trade-off between raising revenue and generating economic activity and prosperity. So high taxes will get you less inequality, but also a lot less prosperity. So I guess I'm almost out of time. 2 other quick things, just about smoothing over shocks, right? That's this other idea. We need the government to come in and smooth over shocks. I think that the two examples I mentioned, I'll just have to go through this very quickly, are one, the financial crisis, where you had a housing bubble that burst that led to the collapse of some large banks. The stock market plunged, unemployment spiked. Federal governments got in there and said, we got to do something. So they bought a lot of government bonds through the central bank. Congress bailed out car companies. They bailed out the banks. Unemployment insurance got extended. So they got to come in and say, we saved the day. The banks and General Motors, the car companies, are too big to fail. It'll be too much of a disaster if we let these companies go bankrupt. I guess they forgot the fact that companies in the United States go bankrupt all the time, because bankruptcy is not a funeral for a company. It's not the end of a company, just a restructuring of the company's debts. But they felt they needed to rescue these companies, which really meant rescuing the bondholders of these companies, rescuing the investors in these companies, much more than the employees. Longer term consequences, you had a much bigger regulatory regime, erosion of public trust in institutions, and moral hazard, these companies all knowing that, no, they don't have to perform well going forward. Government will just come in and bail them out if things go badly. They said, though, that, well, this is a once in a generation thing that happened, or 6 standard deviations from the mean. Well, it's just funny how often stuff happens that seems to be a major crisis where the government says they need to come in and do something. COVID crisis, right? So economic shutdown due to these lockdowns and also fear, big rise in unemployment. What the government did on the spending side, $6 trillion in income support, $900 billion for state and local governments, expanded the safety net, claiming that this was going to ease the effect of falling incomes and prevent bankruptcies. Surely there were some things that the government might have been able to do to facilitate avoiding excessive liquidation of companies that might have gone bankrupt and things like that. But the longer term consequences, where you saw inflation that eroded savings, the lockdowns created severe learning loss, and you end up with massively expanded federal powers. The government basically bribed people to accept the lockdowns with all of this money, and that's part of also why we're in the situation we are now. So, conclusion, I think, government plays an important role in these things, these 3 things in particular. 1, enforcing the rule of law. 2, creating a social safety net for those who are truly unable to support themselves. And 3, providing public services where there are true dangers of market failures. But we don't really do enough introspection of whether the extent of government that we have now is really serving these 3 purposes well. And the question as to whether it maybe is just going way, way overboard with far too much overreach. I think, overreach in any of these areas, here's the Leviathan with a COVID mask on, right, leads to interference with the market. It leads to large-scale inefficiencies, and overall, it leads to reduced prosperity. Interestingly, I think Israel has chosen a relatively smaller non-defense government sector and has lower debt than many declining European counterparts, but has been incredibly successful on a lot of economic measures and outcomes, and has been able to have more economic dynamism despite this defense, the burden of the defense costs. So, hope in this lecture I've managed to pique your interest a bit in the serious problem of what the appropriate size of government is, and maybe to focus thinking a little bit of going back to the basics on what the role of government really should be in a free society.